This video is an extract from the Subversion training available from principia-it.co.uk/training/subversion. If you've been following along with the course, you'll have noted that when we looked at the status command, there was a special ignore status. This was indicated by an I in the first column of the output of the status command. This ignore status indicates that the items have been ignored by the Subversion client. How then do we control what is ignored and what is not ignored by the Subversion client? The mechanism used is called an ignore list. An ignore list is a list of file patterns. Any file matching a pattern on the ignore list will be ignored by the Subversion client. The ignore list is built by two different mechanisms. Firstly, there is the global ignores list, and then there is the svn::ignores property. We look at properties later in the course, so we'll ignore the svn::ignores property for now, and we'll look at it in more detail when we look at properties later in the course. In this session, we'll focus on the global ignores list. The global ignores is provided as part of the client configuration. This gives you, the Subversion user, complete control over what is ignored by your client. By contrast, the svn::ignores is a property set on the directories within a repository and is therefore controlled by the repository, not by the individual users. Change your current working directory so that you're in the ignore-list directory that will be part of the working copies area that comes in the pack that accompanies this course. This ignore list directory is a specially prepared working copy, specifically to demonstrate the ins and outs of the ignore list. The first thing we want to do is list the status of the current working directory. You'll notice that there are a number of unversioned items. Specifically, the add-dir is unversioned, newfile.txt is unversioned, and this dir to be added.txt is unversioned. You'll also notice that there is one file that has been modified. This is saved.o. These items will become important as we describe the ignore list. Next, we'll request the status of the same working copy, but this time specifying the no-ignore option to the status command. As we learned in the earlier session when we dealt with the status command, this displays the status of items within the working copy, irrespective of whether or not they match the ignore list. The files that were previously ignored by the status command, but which are no longer ignored with the no-ignore option, are listed with an I in the first column. So you'll notice that the question mark next to the add-dir newfile.txt and this dir to be added.txt are still present, but in addition we've got ignore.o, maybe.lo, and this dir ignore here too.o. These files match entries on the ignore list. One file that's worth noting is that save.o that was marked as modified. In fact, this matches an ignore pattern also, but because it's already considered to be a version-controlled file, the ignore list is no longer effective. This is an important point. Any item which is already considered to be a version-controlled item is not ignored by the Subversion client, even if it matches an existing ignore pattern. So, where is the global ignore list set? It is set in the Subversion client configuration file. We edited this file once before when we looked at configuring the editor command for the commit operation. As previously mentioned, on a Windows system this is typically found within the user's application data directory under Subversion. Here I'm just going to use the notepad command to edit that configuration file once more so that we can take a look at the global ignore list. Scrolling down the configuration file, you'll eventually come to a section headed Miscellany, under which you will find a setting called Global Ignores. By default, Global Ignores is commented out. However, the global ignores shown are considered to be defaults. Consequently, the global ignores pattern star.o and star.lo are effective, hence the files that are ignored when we looked at the status command. Rather than relying on the default, let's uncomment the global ignore setting, and we'll join the following line onto the end. It's important to note that the global ignore setting in the configuration file must all appear on one line. So Although the patterns are shown here on a second commented out line, they must be joined to the end of the global ignores line in order to have an effect. The global ignores list is a white space separated list of file patterns. The file patterns used in the ignores list are those you'd expect from most operating systems. So for example, a star character or asterisk represents any number of any character within the file name. So the first pattern shown, the star.o pattern, will match any file that ends with .o. Looking slightly further along, you'll notice that there is a file pattern that reads star.so. Then there are some open brackets 0-9 close square brackets star. This bracketed range is a common convention and represents any one occurrence of the characters 0 through 9. So this file pattern will match anything which contains the characters .so. followed by a single digit anywhere in the file name. And as with standard file matching, a query or question mark will represent a single character within the file name. Okay, for the purposes of illustrating the effect of the global ignores, we're going to remove one of these patterns. Specifically, we're going to remove the star.lo pattern from the global ignores list. Once we've uncommented the global ignores list and edited out the pattern, we simply save the configuration file. As soon as we save the configuration file, the Subversion client's configuration is modified so that the new global ignore list has an immediate effect. Just before moving on, take a look at the results of running the svn status command with the no-ignore option. Notice that the maybe.lo file is marked with I for ignore, and that in the first svn status command it's not listed at all. Repeating the svn status command without the no-ignore option now lists maybe.lo with a question mark. This indicates that maybe.lo is no longer ignored and shows that it is an unversioned file. This is because we removed the star.lo pattern from the global ignores list when we were editing the configuration file. Repeating the status command option with the no-ignore option specified, the ignore.o file is still ignored because we left the star.o option in the global ignores list. Similarly, the nested ignore here 2.o file contained within the this.dir is also ignored. But once again, the maybe.lo file still shows a question mark. It is considered by the Subversion client to be an unversioned file because it no longer matches any entry on the global ignore list.